All right, you guys, we're going to continue along with the review. We are on question 19. This page is asking us to identify whether or not the triangles are congruent, and if so, state the reason. Now, if triangles are congruent, you need at least one of these 5 theorems of information to tell if they're going to be congruent, okay? So in number 19, we have 2 triangles, okay? And we have angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, and we have one pair of sides that are congruent. So right now I only have 2 congruent things. I need to find what that third congruent pair is. Well, if I look, side BD is in both triangles. By the reflexive property, it's going to be congruent to itself. So when I'm picking out my theorem, I need to look at the information from just one triangle. I have a side, another side, and the angle between them, which are marked congruent. So I'm looking for the name that matches 2 sides and the angle between congruent, which in this case would be side angle side. So since side angle side allows me to say that they're congruent, then my answer would be yes by side angle side. The next picture is not what we're going to do. We're going to do 21, sorry. Forget I'm doing odds. In this picture, we have 2 triangles. We have one pair of congruent sides and a second pair of congruent sides. However, my triangles are not touching, so they don't have anything in common. They're not overlapping to where they share a side or an angle. I don't see them meeting in a bow tie shape, which makes vertical angles. So there's nothing here that I can add that is a fact that they're going to be congruent. So I don't have enough information because I only have 2 congruent pairs. So this would be a no, and there's really no reason for it, but I'm going to write not enough info to say that these are congruent. So now y'all remember the reasons that you can have that are going to be no's are as if you see angle, angle, angle doesn't prove congruence. Angle, side, side does not also prove congruence. And if you have less than 3 congruent pairs, you have too little information. Okay, so that also does not prove congruence. All right, moving down to 23. We have these 2 sides are both 2, which means they're congruent to each other. We have these 2 sides are both 6, which means they're congruent to each other. I currently have 2 pairs of congruent things. These triangles are side by side, so I could say that side they share is congruent to itself. And with just that piece of information, I can say, yes, these are congruent because we have all 3 sides congruent to each other. So that would be side, side, side. Let's say I didn't see that side in the middle. Another way you could have solved this one is because we have a right angle on the left side, there's automatically one on the right side. So I have a right triangle where I have the hypotenuse and the leg congruent to the hypotenuse and the leg of the second triangle. So you could have also said this was hypotenuse leg. That just depends on the marks that you made. Make sure whatever marks you put match the theorem that you use. All right, number 25. Number 25 has a pair of angles congruent. It also has a pair of sides congruent. Since they share the side AC, I know AC is congruent to itself. So when I look at this, I have 2 sides and an angle that's not between because they don't meet. Remember, the angle that is between the 2 sides is at the corner that they meet, and right now we don't have that. So we have 2 sides and an angle. This is the only theorem that works for 2 sides and an angle, but this one says the angle's between, and it's not. Right now we have 2 sides and the angle outside of, which means we have a no theorem. That does not work, so I would say no, these are not congruent because it is the wrong theorem. Doesn't work. Number 27, AE is parallel to BD, and BE is parallel to CD. Those marks were not on my picture, so I'm going to add those. It also told me B is the midpoint of AC. If B is the midpoint, that means it's exactly the same distance from A and C. So right now, I have one pair of congruent sides, but those parallel lines tell me I have angles that are congruent. So if I highlight the first pair, the line that touches both of those is line AC. So that allows me to relate the angles 1 and 5 together because they're right where the parallel line and the transversal meet. These angles are corresponding. Remember, corresponding angles are congruent. The other pair of lines that's parallel are these two. We have the same transversal. So if I mark which ones are sandwiched between the parallel lines and the transversal, that gives me 2 and 6. 2 and 6 are also corresponding, so they're going to be congruent. I now have 1, 2, 3 pairs of congruent things, which is enough information as long as it fits one of my theorems. This one right here, we have in one triangle, you look at the theorem, you have 2 angles and the side between them. When I read through these theorems, 2 angles and the side between them would be angle, side, angle. So I would say 27 is yes because of angle, side, angle. All right, number 29. 29 is telling you to use angle, angle, side postulate, and it wants to know what additional information we need to prove the triangle is congruent. So the first piece of information is that there is a right angle here, which means there's automatically a right angle there. Okay, so we've got 2 right triangles. If we're going to use angle, angle, side, we want to make sure we have enough pairs. So right now, these 2 angles are clearly the first pair of angles that are congruent. Another thing that I know is automatically congruent is the side in between them. So the only thing we're missing is another angle pair. The only angle pair that will make this be angle, angle, side instead of angle, side, angle would be if the side is not touching the other angle that's congruent. NO touches angle N and angle O. So if I want to pick the angle that's not touching it, that would be M and P. So I would say angle M has to be congruent to angle P. That's the last piece of information to say that those are congruent by angle, angle, side. All right, now 31 through 36 in your review don't have blanks filled in for proofs. So we've attached this second sheet of the same proofs. I'm going to work just the odds with you. Starting with 31. All right, when you hit triangle proofs, you want to make sure you mark up your picture and decide what theorem you're using before you even do the proof. The first given is that BD bisects angle ADC. When BD bisects that angle, it means it's cutting it into 2 equal pieces. So I'm going to put those arcs there to show that those are equal. The second given is that AD is congruent to CD, which is only 2 pairs. So there's one more thing that I should be able to add since these triangles are supposed to be congruent. The last thing that we can add would be this inside piece that DB is congruent to itself because it's in both triangles, which would be by the reflexive property. So when I look at this picture, when I identify which theorem it would be a side, an angle in between, another side. So this would be side, angle, side. The reason I write all that up there is because essentially we've proved those triangles congruent already. Now we just have to put our thought process on paper, which is just to let other people see it so that they can understand what we decided about this. Now, the first couple of steps of your proof towards the top are your givens. My first given is that BD bisects angle ADC, and the reason is because it was given. And then I have another given reason down here, which is for my second given, which happens to be that AD is congruent to CD. Now look at the second step. Part B says angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. When I look to my picture, I ask myself, why? I already have congruent marks there, so why did I put those there? Well, we interpreted the first given word was that it was bisected. This angle was bisected to make two congruent angles. Because I know what bisect means, that allows me to say those two angles are congruent. So I would say this is the definition of the word that we defined, which would be bisect. Step D says we have to use the reflexive property to name something else. What was the third mark that we said was congruent? Well, we put 1 and 2 were congruent. We already have that AD is congruent to CD. The last thing we said was that DB is congruent to itself because of the reflexive property. So this would be DB is congruent to DB. Now I see my triangles are congruent. Triangles are congruent by your theorem that you chose, so this would be side angle side. All right, skip to number 33. Number 33 gives us information that the sides of this shape are parallel. So I'm going to put arrows on DA and BC, which is the first given. I'm also going to put arrows on AB and a different number so that they're parallel to each other, and CD. All right, remember when you have parallel lines, you have angles that are congruent. So if I mark the first set and the transversal that crosses them, the angles that I can say are congruent here are 1 and 4, because 1 and 4 are sandwiched between the parallel line and the transversal. Remember, those are alternate interior. The other pair I would say are congruent are from the other set of parallel lines. Now we have the same transversal in this case, so I want to mark the angles that are sandwiched between the parallel lines and the transversal. So that would be that angle 2 and angle 3 are congruent. And those are also alternate interior angles. The last little piece that they share in this left triangle and the right triangle is the side in between because of reflexive property. So when I look at this in one triangle, we have two angles and the side between it. So I would say two angles and the side between would be angle side angle. So now let's hit our proof. Let's do the givens first. Step 1 is the first given. Step 2 says name the second given, so that would be AB is parallel to CD. Step 3 says that 2 is congruent to 3. 2 is congruent to 3. What kind of angles did we say those were? Well, think about it. They're on opposite sides. They're between the lines. Those are alternate interior angles. And the way that we state that is that alternate interior angles are congruent. Part D says we use that same thing, but to talk about different angles. We've already mentioned 2 and 3 are alternate interior. The other pair we talked about were 1 and 4. So this step must say angle 1 is congruent to angle 4. Step E says that BD is the same as DB. I'm tracing the same line when I mark DB and BD. When you have the same line that you're talking about on both sides, this is the reflexive property. The last step is the triangle congruent statement. Triangles are congruent, we already said, because of angle side angle. So I mark that on my proof. All right, last one we're going to do is number 35. Number 35 is similar to the one we just worked first. We have a similar picture. This time they tell us that D is the midpoint of AC. D is the midpoint of AC, which means D is the same distance to A and C, and that AB is congruent to CD. I only have two pairs here, so I have to think about what's the third pair. Well, that middle piece is in both triangles, it is congruent to itself by the reflexive property. And when I look at one side, it'll tell me my theorem is going to be side, side, side. All right, now we've proved them congruent on paper. Now let's prove them congruent on my on the actual proof. D is the midpoint of AC, came from the given. The second given is the second piece, which would be AB is congruent to CD. Then we were supposed to use the definition of midpoint. When we define midpoint, I want to think about what marks I actually put on my picture. When I said D was the midpoint of AC, I put these marks. This is the statement. AD is congruent to CD. Step D says that BD is congruent to itself. BD, that would be the reflexive property. And then step E is that triangles are congruent. We said they were congruent by side, side, side. So that's where side, side, side goes. All right, you guys, good luck studying with this for this test. If you have any questions, make sure you're coming into tutoring.